By the time the search party reached the upper shoulder of Kholat Syakhl in late February 1959, the mountain had already started erasing the story. Wind had packed the snow into a hard skin. Old tracks were fading into pale seams. The campsite they were looking for should have been obvious, a bright tent against an open slope. Instead, they found a low, collapsed shape half buried in drift, the cloth pressed flat as if the mountain had leaned down and put a hand over it. Nothing about the scene suggested an ordinary retreat from bad weather. The tent was still standing in the technical sense, but only barely. Its poles were broken or slumped. Skis used as supports were frozen into the crust. Boots, blankets, food, and spare clothing remained inside. A stove was present but not set up for heat. If the group had decided to abandon camp calmly, even in a hurry, they would have taken the things that make survival possible first. Instead, the essentials were left behind, and 9 people had gone out into the dark with almost none of them. Then came the detail that altered the entire case posture. The tent fabric had been cut from within. Several deliberate, irregular slits crossed the canvas where a knife had opened improvised emergency exits through the wall itself. Searchers did not have to reconstruct direction afterward. These were not rescue cuts made later from outside after discovery. They were openings made by the occupants, under pressure, while still inside the shelter. There were signs of people inside the tent choosing, or feeling compelled, to get out, so fast that the normal entrance no longer mattered. The slope below the tent offered the next fragment. There were tracks, though not many, and not clean enough to answer every question people later tried to force from them. Some prints suggested that several members of the party went downslope in socks or with only partial footwear. The line of movement was not a panic stampede. The tracks did not show the wild scattering you would expect if the group had been physically attacked at the tent line. Instead, there was something even stranger about them. They looked controlled, as if the people leaving the tent were trying to stay together while moving away from immediate danger. Downhill, at the edge of the forest, stood a large cedar. Beneath it, searchers found signs of a small fire. Branches high above the trunk were broken, suggesting that someone had climbed for visibility or in desperation. 2 bodies lay near the tree. 3 more were later found between the cedar and the tent, positioned almost like failed attempts to return uphill. Months after the first discovery, 4 more bodies emerged from a ravine under deep snow. The 9 missing hikers had not vanished into folklore. They had died in places that formed a rough pattern. The pattern was real. The explanation was not. The official Soviet investigation would eventually close the case with a phrase so broad it sounded less like a conclusion than a sealed door, a compelling natural force. That formula solved nothing for the public. It told people only that the state wanted the deaths filed under something larger than human control and smaller than a full public answer. Into that gap poured every theory that Cold War fear, mountain mythology, and human pattern hunger could produce. Military testing, secret weapons, escaped prisoners, Mansi attack, infrasound, spies, radiation, even things not of this world. But before all of that came the basic fact that still gives the incident its power. A skilled winter group made camp on an exposed slope. Sometime during the night, they cut their way out of their own shelter. They moved into life-killing cold without proper gear. Some reached the tree line. None survived. The bodies, the tent, the weather, and the terrain all existed in the same physical world. Whatever happened there had to pass through cloth, snow, gravity, fear, and human decision under stress. The mystery was not abstract. It was material. That material quality is what keeps the Dyatlov Pass incident from collapsing into a campfire story. There are names, training records, route plans, photographs, diary entries, autopsies, search reports, and a mountain that can still be visited. There is no monster standing in the frame. There is no perfect witness who can tell us what the group saw or thought in the final minutes. There is only a chain of physical evidence and the lasting discomfort of a story where nearly every clue is concrete, while the moment that matters most remains unwitnessed. The hardest part is that the scene seems to promise clarity. An abandoned tent should lead to a direct reason. Tracks should reveal a flight path. Body positions should explain decisions, yet each clue in this case is both revealing and incomplete. The cuts in the tent tell us speed mattered. The left-behind boots tell us the departure was not orderly. The controlled descent suggests the group had not dissolved into chaos immediately. The fire under the cedar proves at least some of them were still trying to solve the situation after leaving camp. Every fact narrows the possibilities. None of them closes the case entirely. To understand why the incident still feels so alive, we have to step back from the legend and return to the people who walked onto that mountain in the first place. Before the shredded tent, before the ravine, before the official silence and decades of theories, there was a student expedition organized by people who knew winter travel, trusted their skills, and expected to come back with the satisfaction of a hard route completed. The distance between that beginning and the scene on the slope is the real case file. Before we chase causes, we need the people back in frame. The next chapter is about the 9 who chose this route, what kind of winter travelers they were, and why their competence matters so much. The expedition was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute. Around him was a group that was young, serious, and more capable than the later mystery often encourages people to imagine. These were not tourists who stumbled into the wrong weather wearing city shoes. Most had substantial experience in difficult winter routes. They trained, skied long distances, kept diaries, took photographs, and treated the trip as the kind of demanding challenge that signaled competence and pride inside the Soviet outdoor culture of the period. The full team originally numbered 10. One member, Yuri, turned back early because illness and physical pain made the route unrealistic for him. That decision left 9 on the mountain: Dyatlov, Zinaida Komolgorova, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonischenko, Alexander Kolovatov, Ludmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Semyon Zolotaryov. Yudin would later become the only direct survivor of the group, not because he endured the event, but because he exited the story before the fatal section began. His memory would matter precisely because it ended where the official record grew thin. What they intended to do was difficult, but not reckless in the obvious sense. The route aimed toward Otorten in the northern Urals and qualified as a serious winter expedition. The terrain was remote. The weather could turn without warning. Progress depended on endurance, navigation, and constant practical judgment. But this was exactly why the trip carried prestige. Soviet expedition culture rewarded technical toughness and collective discipline. A winter route was not just recreation. It was proof of capability, and a successful crossing fed both personal identity and institutional reputation. The last photographs and diary notes we have from the trip do not read like omens. They show people at work, tired and joking, dealing with the small logistics that fill any long journey in severe weather. Skis are adjusted, camp routines are repeated, clothing is layered and dried, meals are prepared. The group appears cohesive. Even when conditions slow them, there is no sign and no surviving fragments that they think they are stepping into a mystery that will one day be read frame by strangers. That normality matters. It means the terror of the final night did not grow out of an already broken team. There is also the mountain itself, which later became almost a character in retellings. Kholat Syakhl is often translated as something close to Dead Mountain from the Mansi language, and the ominous name has helped the case attract myth. But harsh place names are common in difficult country. A dangerous landscape does not become supernatural because local language treats it honestly. The northern Urals are exposed, wind-scoured, and capable of turning small errors into terminal ones. The group knew enough to respect that. The point is not that they walked innocently into a cursed zone. The point is that they entered a real environment with real hazards and still ended up in circumstances that seemed to exceed the hazards they planned for. Yuri Yudin's departure sharpened the emotional outline of the story. He left because his body was telling him something simple and trustworthy: do not keep going. The others continued. There is no reason to imagine conflict in that split. People turn back on expeditions all the time. But later, after the deaths were known, Yudin carried the impossible burden of being the one man who had touched the same gear, shared the same early trail, and then stepped away before the mountain closed. Every object he remembered from the party gained retrospective weight. Every impression of the group's mood seemed like it ought to mean more than it could. The 9 who continued were not identical personalities, and that helps explain why the incident resists flattening into a single emotional narrative. Some were technically minded, some expressive, some older, some younger, some already seasoned by military or industrial work. Zolotaryov, older than most of the group and a war veteran, brought a different life history from the students around him. Dubinina was known as sharp and forceful. Kolmogorova appears in accounts as energetic and socially central. Dyatlov carried the leadership burden. A real group contains differences in confidence, patience, and fear thresholds. Any theory of the last night has to make sense, not for a symbolic expedition, but for 9 specific people reacting under pressure. Their equipment was period-specific and finite. A canvas tent, skis, poles, warm but not magical clothing, food, a stove, axes, knives, notebooks, and cameras made up the ordinary world of the route. In modern retellings, it is easy to overestimate what mid-century winter gear could forgive. The margin between endurance and catastrophe was narrower. A wrong camp placement, a nighttime emergency, or even a short uncontrolled exposure could become fatal far faster than comfortable hindsight allows. Yet the same fact cuts both ways. Experienced hikers in that environment knew the value of boots, coats, and shelter instinctively. Leaving those things behind still demands an explanation strong enough to overpower training. One of the reasons the Dyatlov case remains compelling is that the 9 feel recoverable but never fully reachable. We have enough record to understand them as disciplined young people, not enough to hear their final internal debate. We can infer a group ethic from the route itself. They were willing to work hard, travel light, and accept discomfort as part of the reward. They expected return. They had plans for telegrams and schedules. They moved through the trip as people inhabiting the future. That future is what the incident tears away. The mystery does not begin with anonymous bodies. It begins with competent people whose habits should have helped them survive. If there is a single emotional engine beneath every later theory, it is the refusal to accept that a group like this could die in a sequence that looks at once orderly and irrational. 9 capable people leave a tent in severe cold. They do not come back. To many observers, that gap feels too large to be filled by weather and terrain alone. The rest of the case lives inside that feeling. But feelings are not verdicts. To get closer to the truth, we have to move from who the group was to where the route took them in its final days, when the terrain tightened and the conditions worsened. Now that the group is real, the key question shifts to the last normal hours. We are going back onto the slope to watch camp placement, weather pressure, and the decision that narrowed every option. As the group advanced deeper into the route, the trip became slower and more physically expensive. Snow conditions, navigation, and weather all made progress harder than planned. There is evidence that they lost time and had to adapt. In winter mountain travel, delay does not necessarily signal crisis. It can mean only that every task takes longer. Breaking trail, correcting course, setting camp, dealing with wind, keeping hands warm enough to work, protecting supplies, and making constant small choices about effort versus exposure. A route can remain under control while still drifting away from its ideal schedule. What matters most is the decision around February 1, when the group moved on to the eastern shoulder of Kholat Syakhl instead of making a more protected camp in the forest below. That choice has been debated for decades because it sits so close to the unknown event itself. One possibility is that worsening weather and poor visibility led them to stop earlier than intended while traversing the slope. Another is that Dyatlov may have chosen to keep altitude and avoid losing progress into the trees. A third is simply fatigue combined with the belief that the site was acceptable for one night. None of those ideas is dramatic. All of them are plausible. The camp they built was functional but exposed. The tent was partially cut into the slope, with snow used to stabilize and shield it. That arrangement has often been treated either as proof of expert control or proof of fatal error, when it was likely some of both. Experienced people make compromised camps all the time in bad conditions. A site can be workable under one set of forces and deadly under another. The openness of the slope gave the group limited protection from wind and almost none from any movement in the snow above them. It also placed them at a distance from the forest, where wood, cover, and visual landmarks would have been easier to use if an emergency forced them out. The surviving diary notes and photographs from the final period still look painfully normal. They show route work, camp labor, tired humor, and the routine materiality of winter travel. That normality does not tell us the final night was calm. It tells us only that the final night had not announced itself in a way that broke the record before darkness. The mountain does not send a memo before conditions tip from difficult to lethal. If something changed after the group settled in, the evidence of that change would need to survive in objects, injuries, and terrain, not in a written warning from the dead. At some point after nightfall, the stable logic of camp life fractured. Exactly how remains the center of the case. If a slab of snow pressed onto the tent or threatened to do so, the interior could have become a trap in seconds. If the group believed a larger slide might follow, every instinct would favor immediate escape over orderly dressing. If strong wind, darkness, and cold then prevented a rapid return, a situation that began as a practical emergency could have transformed into a survival spiral. This explanation has gained strength in recent years because it does not require impossible forces. It requires only a brief initial event and a brutal environment amplifying every next decision. Still, even the natural explanation leaves a hard human picture. Imagine the inside of the tent after dark, fabric snapping, snow pressure shifting, bodies crowded close, someone deciding the entrance is too slow, blocked, or badly positioned for immediate exit. Knife in hand, cuts in canvas, cold striking instantly, people not fully dressed. Descent begun under shared understanding that this is temporary, that they will regroup below, then come back for boots and coats once the danger passes. The later evidence fits that kind of temporary thinking better than it fits a deliberate abandonment of shelter forever. The route downhill matters. The group did not scatter in 9 unrelated directions. Tracks and later body locations suggest movement toward the tree line, where the forest offered some protection from wind. That choice makes sense if the slope itself felt unsafe. It also makes sense if visibility near the tent had collapsed. Reaching the cedar and building a fire suggests the group retained a collective survival logic for at least part of the ordeal. They were not instantly incapacitated by some mysterious beam or impossible force. They were trying to do what exposed people in lethal cold do: find cover, create heat, assess whether return is possible. What failed afterward may have been less dramatic than the internet prefers and more terrible than neat theories allow. Severe cold narrows time. Wetness, wind, exhaustion, and inadequate footwear reduce it further. Fine motor skill goes early. Judgment changes. Group coordination frays. Some members may have been stronger, some more injured, some better clothed after exchanging garments. The pattern of the bodies suggests that at least a few tried to move back uphill toward the tent and died before reaching it. Others stayed near the cedar fire. The 4 later found in the ravine may have been building a more durable shelter in snow or seeking deeper protection when the terrain gave way beneath them. This is where the case becomes difficult to narrate honestly. People want one cinematic cause: an attack, an experiment, a cover-up, a monster. But the physical evidence may point towards something more fragmented and therefore more haunting. There may have been one trigger event, followed by several survival decisions, each rational in the moment, each progressively constrained by cold, darkness, terrain, and injury. The night is not empty. It is brutally hard to recover afterward. It is missing because what happened may have been fast, practical, and unspectacular at first, then impossible to recover once the group passed the point where recovery to the tent was still feasible. When searchers later reached the slope, they were looking at the residue of those decisions without access to the sequence that joined them. A tent cut from inside. A downhill path. A fire. Bodies in stages of distance and exposure. A ravine. These are not random fragments. They are the bones of a story. But the scene keeps refusing the last clean bridge between them. To see how that bridge may have failed, we have to follow the search itself and the order in which the mountain gave the dead back. This is where the case stops feeling like biography and starts feeling like terrain. The next chapter follows the search itself, because the mountain gave the story back in pieces and in a brutal order. The alarm did not sound the instant the expedition missed its expected communication. In that era, in that terrain, schedule drift could happen without catastrophe. Families worried, institute staff waited, search efforts grew in stages, volunteers, students, local personnel, and later military resources joined in. This delay has sometimes been treated as suspicious, but it also reflects the practical rhythm of remote expedition monitoring. The group was operating in country where weather and route conditions regularly altered timing. The problem is that by the time the search tightened, any chance of rescue had already been consumed by the cold. Finding the tent did not resolve uncertainty. It amplified it. Searchers were confronted with a campsite that looked abandoned under coercion. Equipment remained, food remained, warm clothing remained. The damaged canvas, partly snowed over, suggested a night event rather than a planned departure. On a mountain route, a lost camp can sometimes read clearly: relocation, collapse, avalanche burial, or simple withdrawal. This one read like interruption. It looked as if the expedition had been severed from its shelter instead of choosing to leave it as the next stage of travel. The line from the tent to the cedar gave the case its next geometry. The tree stood at the forest edge, a landmark large enough to attract movement in darkness and bad weather. Beneath it was evidence of fire. Broken branches high up the trunk implied climbing, perhaps to look back toward camp or to break wood in desperation. 2 bodies, Doroshenko and Krivonischenko, were found there first. Their state suggested extreme cold exposure and an attempt to survive with too little protection. They were not arranged ceremonially. They were where ordeal had ended. Then came the bodies between the cedar and the tent: Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. Their positions encouraged an intuitive story that still shapes the case. It looked as though they had tried to go back uphill and failed at different points on the slope. Whether they were returning for gear, orienting by the tent's position, or acting from a leader's instinct to re-establish shelter, the pattern carries a brutal logic. They had left the tent quickly, reached temporary cover, then at least some concluded that survival below was not enough, and that the only real chance lay in recovering what had been abandoned above. The remaining 4 were not found with the others because the mountain hid them longer. Deep snow in a ravine concealed Dubinina, Kolovatov, Thibaut Brignol, and Zolotaryov until spring melt and continued search revealed them months later. Their location is one reason the incident never settled into a simple hypothermia narrative for the public. A ravine suggests a secondary movement, a new shelter attempt, or a fall into more dangerous terrain after the initial flight from the tent. It implies that the group's final hours were not one frozen tableau, but a shifting survival effort unfolding across different micro-locations. Search reports and later reconstructions have sometimes been pulled too hard toward whatever theory came afterward. Yet even without that distortion, the terrain itself shapes interpretation. The upper slope is exposed and legible, almost theatrical in its emptiness. The forest edge complicates the picture by offering wood, cover, and shadow. The ravine adds depth, concealment, and the possibility of snow burial. In other words, the landscape naturally divides the event into stages: camp emergency, descent, temporary regrouping, attempted return, and deeper shelter effort. The geography does not tell us the trigger. It does tell us the crisis did not end when the group left the tent. Cold also changes what a searcher sees. By the time bodies are found after significant exposure, posture and damage reflect not only the final living action, but the environment's work after death. Snow loads shift limbs. Freeze and thaw cycles alter surfaces. Scavenging and decomposition proceed unevenly. A body at a tree line and a body in a snow-filled ravine do not preserve the same kind of story. This is one reason lurid retellings often overstate what the recovered remains can prove. The search found real evidence. But real evidence in an alpine winter always arrives after weather has already edited it. Even so, several points remained difficult to absorb within an ordinary accident frame. Why was the tent cut instead of exited normally? Why was it pitched where it was? Why were some members so poorly dressed? Why did the group not make it back once immediate danger on the slope had passed? Why were the injuries of the ravine 4 so severe compared with those found earlier? Questions like these kept the case open in public imagination because each one seemed to point beyond simple exposure, while never fully escaping the reach of terrain and cold. The searchers, however, were not working inside a later internet of infinite theory. They were moving through snow, reporting what existed, and trying to assemble a dead expedition from scattered physical signs. Their experience on the mountain matters because it grounds the case. The Dyatlov incident was not born as folklore, it became folklore after being born as a practical search problem. People climbed that slope, touched the tent, saw the tree, uncovered the bodies, and tried to understand how a trained group could leave life-preserving gear behind and die in a pattern that looked both purposeful and broken. By the time the last four were recovered from the ravine, the case had already split into two stories. One story was about the chronology of discovery. The other was about the injuries and state of the dead, which seemed to invite darker explanations the moment details reached the public. To stay honest, we have to approach that second story carefully. The bodies did speak. They just did not speak in the simple language theory hunters wanted. Searchers could trace the geometry of the night, but the bodies carried the harder testimony. What comes next is not shock theater. It is the physical evidence of how the group's survival logic broke apart. The first and most universal testimony from the bodies was cold. In different ways, every recovery pointed toward exposure as a decisive factor. The group had spent lethal time outside in winter mountain conditions without adequate shelter or full protection. That part is not controversial. What created controversy were the differences among the dead, where they were found, what they were wearing, and what kinds of injuries appeared on some but not others. Those differences made people feel that exposure alone could not explain the event, even though exposure may still have been the final mechanism for most of the party. The two found beneath the cedar appeared to have endured extreme cold with minimal clothing. The remains of the fire nearby suggest active survival effort. Broken branches above hint that one or both may have climbed for sight or fuel. These details fit a situation in which at least part of the group reached the tree line alive, tried to generate heat, and attempted to maintain orientation toward the slope. The fire was not a symbol. It was a short, practical answer to immediate suffering. Its existence proves not only desperation, but organized action after the tent was abandoned. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, found between the cedar and the tent, appeared to represent a second phase. Whether they moved as a group or in sequence, their positions suggest intention toward the camp. Some interpreters see heroism there, others command responsibility. Others, the simple recognition that no one survives long in a forest edge without boots, coats, and equipment. What matters most is that the pattern does not support total confusion. People are making directional choices. Even impaired by cold, they still understood where the center of survival had been and what it contained. The ravine floor complicated the picture because their injuries were far more serious. Thibaut Brignol had a major skull fracture. Dubinina and Zolotaryov suffered severe chest trauma. These injuries helped drive theories of attack, or blast, because they looked disproportionate to what many readers imagined a cold weather escape would produce. Yet injuries do not interpret themselves. A fall into a ravine, collapse under heavy snow, or compression in a terrain trap can produce extreme blunt trauma without leaving the kind of superficial damage popular imagination expects from interpersonal violence. In other words, severe injury is real evidence of force, but not automatic evidence of a murderer. One of the most repeated details in sensational retellings is the loss of soft tissue from Dubinina's face and tongue. Presented without context, it has fueled decades of monstrous speculation. In context, bodies lying for months under running meltwater, snow pressure, and natural post-mortem processes can sustain exactly the kind of selective degradation that later storytellers convert into a mystery clue. The detail is disturbing, but disturbance is not analysis. Winter recovery conditions in a ravine are enough to explain why some remains looked more shocking than others without requiring occult mutilation or surgical intent. Clothing distribution among the dead offers a more meaningful line of reasoning. Some members were wearing garments that originally belonged to others. This suggests that after leaving the tent, the group reorganized what little protection they had, likely taking clothes from those who had already died or from supplies available at the tree line. That behavior is grim but rational. It tells us the ordeal lasted long enough for the survivors to move from immediate flight into improvised adaptation. They were not all killed at once by one impossible event. There was time, though not enough, for the living to make decisions around the dead. Radiation traces found on some items of clothing helped open another corridor of theory, especially in a Cold War setting where any anomalous reading seemed to invite military secrecy. But the mere presence of measured contamination does not automatically place the expedition inside a weapons test. Some members had previous work or study environments where contamination exposure was possible. The historical record around those traces is messy enough that they function better as a reason for caution than as a clean key to the whole event. In mystery cases, ambiguous technical data often becomes a magnet for stories far larger than the data can bear. Autopsy language also mattered. Soviet official documents did not always move with the transparency later audiences expect, and that bureaucratic style became part of the legend. Clinical wording, inconsistent clarity, and the famous closing judgment about a compelling natural force all combined to create suspicion that authorities knew more than they said. Sometimes that suspicion may be justified at the level of institutional opacity. But opacity is not the same as concealed monsters or secret executions. Systems often become vague, not because they are hiding the incredible, but because they are uncomfortable admitting uncertainty, embarrassment, or limits in their own reconstruction. What the bodies ultimately say is harsher and less satisfying than most grand theories. They say the group divided in function after leaving the tent. They say some made fire. They say some tried to return. They say some reached a deeper feature in the landscape and suffered catastrophic trauma there. They say clothes were redistributed as circumstances worsened. They say time passed between the first emergency and the final deaths. They say cold dominated the end, even if cold was not the initial trigger. Above all, they say the incident was an unfolding process, not a single frozen frame. This is why the case resists both extremes. It is not solved by waving away every anomaly as simple hypothermia. But it also does not require a fantastical answer merely because the injuries and body locations are complex. Mountains produce layered emergencies. A small triggering event can begin a chain that later looks wildly disproportionate to its start. Once shelter is lost in severe cold, every minute multiplies the cost of every bad position. The bodies do not ask us to believe the impossible. They ask us to respect how quickly a hard route can become a system of failing options. Still, complexity plus official vagueness is exactly the environment in which secondary stories breed. Once the files closed without a satisfying public narrative, the incident became a vessel. Into it went Cold War fear, distrust of authority, hunger for villains, and the irresistible idea that if the physical clues feel cinematic, the cause must have been cinematic too. To understand why the Dyatlov case still splits audiences, we have to walk through those theories and then return to the one explanation that has gained the most serious weight without removing every shadow from the slope. Once the dead are on the table, theories rush in to fill what no witness can. We are moving into secrecy, rumor, and the avalanche question, but the rule stays the same. The physical record leads. Theories around Dyatlov tend to cluster into three broad families. The first imagines an external attacker or hidden human force, escaped prisoners, intelligence agents, local hostility, or military personnel. The second imagines an unusual environmental or technological cause, secret weapons tests, airborne pressure, infrasound, radiation, or luminous phenomena in the sky. The third stays within mountain logic and argues that a natural event, likely a slab release or snow loading emergency, forced the group out, after which cold, darkness, and terrain finish the disaster. Each family survives because it can explain some facts. None survives intact if it claims to explain everything by itself. The human attack theories have always had emotional appeal because they supply motive, fear, and visible agency. But they struggle against the evidence we actually have. There were no clear signs of a violent struggle at the tent. Tracks suggested controlled movement away from camp rather than a chase in multiple directions. The redistribution of clothing, the fire under the cedar, and the apparent attempts to return uphill all read more naturally as survival responses than as the aftermath of an execution or raid. Human violence cannot be ruled out in the abstract, but the case lacks the kind of direct material support that such a theory would need. Military testing theories gained power from context. The late Soviet era trained people to assume secrecy because secrecy was real. Reports of glowing objects in the sky from the broader region have repeatedly been folded into the case. Radiation traces on some clothing seem to widen the door. The official phrase, compelling natural force, sounded evasive enough to encourage suspicion that authorities had chosen abstraction over disclosure. Yet when tested against the physical scene, many military scenarios start to fray. A blast strong enough to terrify the group out of the tent should leave other signatures. An attack that drives them downslope but then lets them build a fire and attempt return becomes hard to model cleanly. Infrasound and related psychological theories have the advantage of preserving a natural cause while still sounding exotic. The idea is that wind interacting with terrain could generate frequencies that induce panic or disorientation. But these explanations often solve one problem by creating several others. Temporary panic does not automatically explain slashed canvas, a controlled descent, fire at the cedar, shared clothing, ravine trauma, and the later body pattern. For a theory to persuade, it has to carry not only the first movement out of the tent, but the whole chain that followed. Many elegant theories fail because they explain departure and then lose the survival logic. The avalanche model once seemed weak because the tent site did not resemble the steep path people pictured from popular images. If there had been a classic giant slide, why was the tent still partly standing? Why were there tracks? Why was the camp not found under a massive debris field? Those objections matter, but they also assume the wrong scale. Recent work on the case has focused less on a cinematic wall of snow and more on the possibility of a small slab release or delayed snow loading on a compromised slope cut. In that model, the tent does not need to be obliterated. It only needs to become suddenly unsafe. A localized slab pressing onto the tent could injure one or more occupants, collapse the shelter enough to force immediate exit, and create a credible fear that a larger release might follow. If the entrance was blocked or too slow under pressure, cutting through the canvas makes sense. If visibility was poor and the slope felt dangerous, moving to the tree line also makes sense. Once there, the group may have expected to recover quickly, only to find that wind, dark, disorientation, worsening injuries, and inadequate clothing made a return far harder than planned. What looks irrational in daylight can become grimly rational when reconstructed minute by minute in lethal cold. This model also helps integrate the ravine injuries without invoking assault. If part of the group moved deeper into the forest seeking a more defensible shelter, they could have entered unstable snow above the ravine or fallen into the feature while weakened and working in darkness. Heavy snow compression in that terrain can generate serious blunt trauma. The later spring recovery conditions would then magnify the difference in appearance between those bodies and the ones found earlier on the open line between cedar and tent. The avalanche theory does not trivialize the injuries. It relocates them inside the landscape rather than outside it. Modern re-examinations by Russian authorities lean toward this kind of natural explanation, specifically a wind slab avalanche or closely related snow movement event. Independent researchers later explored how a small slab combined with the group's own camp cut into the slope might have created delayed instability. These studies did not produce certainty, but they made the natural explanation more technically serious than the old caricature of a giant, obvious avalanche. The case no longer requires us to choose between no avalanche at all and a towering white catastrophe. A modest but urgent snow event may be enough. And yet the avalanche explanation still leaves residue, which is why the case persists. Why exactly did the group camp there instead of lower? How fast did the triggering event unfold? Were some injuries sustained at the tent or only later in the ravine? How much did cold-impaired judgment alter group decisions after the first emergency? Why did official messaging remain so unsatisfying if the broad truth was natural? Those questions do not destroy the natural model. They remind us that a physically plausible explanation is not the same thing as a complete eyewitness record. There is also a psychological reason people resist the avalanche theory. It is too ordinary for the scale of the legend, and too complex for the appetite that legends create. A small snow failure, imperfect camp choice, nighttime confusion, and cascading survival breakdown do not feel mythic enough to match the decades of obsession. But reality does not arrange itself around narrative symmetry. Sometimes, the cause of a famous mystery is not spectacular. Sometimes what endures is not the trigger, but the human cost of how little room the trigger left for correction once events began to slide. If we hold to evidence, the strongest current picture is not that the mountain concealed some supernatural answer. It is not that the state erased a perfect secret operation from every physical trace. It is that a trained group met a localized emergency on an exposed slope, made fast decisions that were understandable inside that emergency, and then found themselves in a sequence where each next move was worse than the one before. The mystery survives because the exact emotional texture of that sequence cannot be fully recovered now. The probable mechanism may be natural. The final experience was almost certainly terror. The strongest natural explanation is finally visible, but explanation is not the same as possession. For the final chapter, we slow down and sit with the residue, because that is where this case still exerts its force. What remains after all the reconstructions is not only a technical question about snow mechanics, it is a human memory problem. 9 people stepped into a remote winter route expecting hardship, skill, and return. Their last camp became one of the 20th century's most durable mystery sites, because the evidence preserves just enough of their final logic to make them feel close, and just enough uncertainty to keep them unreachable. We can see the tent, we can follow the descent, we can stand beneath the cedar, we can look into the ravine. We still cannot hear the sentence spoken inside the tent that turned ordinary camp life into emergency. The Dyatlov Pass incident also endures because it exposes how modern audiences handle uncertainty. Many people would rather accept an extravagant story than live with an incomplete natural one. A secret weapon, an unknown attacker, or a paranormal event can feel emotionally cleaner than a chain of bad luck, compromised terrain, injuries, impaired judgment, and irreversible cold. The spectacular theory restores intention. The natural one leaves us with indifference. A mountain does not hate. Weather does not plot. Snow does not care that the people inside the tent were bright, trained, and young. That indifference may be the hardest fact in the whole case. If the best explanation is broadly natural, then the deaths were not prevented by a missing clue hidden in classified archives so much as by a margin of safety that vanished all at once. A camp set a little too high. Snow behaving a little worse than expected. A decision to move first and recover gear second. A tree line not close enough. Fire not warm enough. Return too difficult. Shelter in the ravine too dangerous. This is not a story about one impossible thing. It is a story about how several possible things can combine faster than skill can reverse them. There is dignity in resisting both sensationalism and reduction. The 9 deserve better than myth-making that turns them into props for monsters, but they also deserve better than a shrug that files them under generic cold-weather loss. Their case matters because it shows the boundary where competence meets environment and loses. It matters because the physical record is rich enough to demand serious thought. It matters because official vagueness gave grief a bureaucratic wall instead of a satisfying explanation. And it matters because every generation seems to rediscover the same discomfort. Evidence can be concrete and still incomplete. This case belongs in the file for exactly that reason. Not because the incident proves the supernatural, and not because it can be flattened into tidy debunking, but because it lives in the pressure between material fact and missing witness. The torn canvas is real. The footprints are real. The cedar fire is real. The ravine is real. The mountain is real. The interpretive fight begins only after those facts are acknowledged. Good documentary storytelling does not invent the answer. It stages the evidence with enough clarity that the shape of the tragedy can be felt without counterfeit certainty. In the end, the Dyatlov case may be less about what came for the group than about what the group faced once they were separated from their tent. The shelter stopped being secure. The slope stopped being safe. The tree line became temporary refuge. The ravine became a final gamble. The bodies recorded the path of those changes, but not the breath between them. That is why the incident lingers. It leaves us standing in the same cold sequence the searchers inherited. Canvas, tracks, cedar, return line, ravine, silence. And perhaps that silence is the cleanest closure we will ever get. Not a dramatic reveal, not an unveiled classified file, not a final villain hauled into view, but an acceptance that some cases resolve by narrowing, not by complete recovery. The strongest explanation may now be visible. The final inner experience of the 9 is not. The mountain kept that. What we can do is keep the record physical, honest, and restrained. We can resist fake evidence, resist comforting spectacle, and stay with the real materials that survived. On that slope in February 1959, the world did not become supernatural. It became suddenly, fatally hard. 9 people crossed a line from expedition discipline into emergency improvisation and never made it back. The mystery survives because the evidence is powerful enough to compel attention and incomplete enough to deny possession. The tent remains the opening image for a reason. It is the moment where ordinary objects stop behaving like ordinary objects. A shelter becomes an exit wound. A camp becomes a question. A mountain becomes an archive. That is where this first case file gold release should leave it. Not solved into comfort, not inflated into nonsense, but held at the exact pressure point where history, terrain, and human judgment met in darkness. The Dyatlov Pass incident endures because it still feels physically near. Wind can still move across that slope. Snow can still hide the ground's shape. Canvas can still tear under a blade. And somewhere between those facts and the silence that followed, 9 voices disappeared into one of the most haunting case files of the modern era. What happened on that slope may never return as a perfect last-minute story. What survives is harder and more honest. Torn canvas, bad weather, human judgment under terror, and a mountain that still refuses to flatter our need for certainty.